Okay, thank you very much for having me here. Thank you to Johnny and everybody who's organised this wonderful conference and get together. Thank you for the dinner. Thank you for the wine. Thank you for the accommodation. Thank you for the good weather today. I just want to make one apology, like everybody else, slight change from the abstract. The first part of the abstract, which some people might have set their hearts on, they want to hear something about the relationship between an individual photograph and photography. Well, I've decided that it wasn't viable given the other themes that I'm going to address, and I think you'll see why. It's pretty heavy going, some of it. But what I would say simply is this, that the issue of the relationship between the individual photograph and photography is not something that is limited to photography as a practice and as an art genre. It could be said to occur in all walks of art. My argument would be that the work, in fact, however, is equivalent to the power of the whole. The work is equivalent to the power of the whole. So that would bring the whole into question, perhaps in a way a little bit similar to Emmanuel Levinas's notion of infinity. If anybody follows Levinas, then you'll know what I mean. All right, so moving on, and I'm just going to read from my laptop. Introduction. The broader context of this paper concerns the human in its transcendence in relation to the image. Despite its genesis, transcendence should not be understood to imply a fixed quality that would mark out the human for eternity. On the other hand, if it is a matter of defending the human, if a defence is appropriate without this entailing an a priori essentialism, transcendence of a certain kind seems to be unavoidable. And moreover, if the reduction of the human to bare life, in Agamben's work, for example, in the play of sovereign power, is to be in any way thwarted, a certain transcendence in relation to the human is indicated. I'm telling you this because I've actually got some money to study the human, and this is part of the dissemination of my results. So young people who are PhD candidates, this is how you aim to be strategic. It's called being strategic. So go to a conference to disseminate the results of your work. Moreover, if the human then as transcendence is not a form, tempting as it might be to view it as such, to be imposed on a recalcitrant content, or perhaps this could be history. Transcendence is not the shape or morphe given to the material of human life. Rather, this transcendence, which is assuredly a transcendence, is open-ended, unbounded. It is the incarnation of invention and creation. From this it follows that despite efforts to realise the opposite tendency being the order of the day, the human is not reducible to bare life, or in terms of a certain philosophy, is not reducible to necessity. But it's always a way or form of life, provided that way or form are not interpreted to mean what is imposed on life, but are rather understood as what becomes perceptible in the play of life and of death. How the image participates in the human is also part of the project broached above. The concern is to investigate the way that the human is constituted by the image rather than the image being a product of the human and as such becoming an object. In his reflection on the films of Guy Debord, Giorgio Agamben has proposed a relationship between the human and the image that is probably widely shared. Agamben says that the human being, as opposed to the animal, is interested in the image for its own sake. When an animal discovers that it is only an image that is involved, it loses interest, whereas by contrast, and as exemplified by cinema, humans are intrigued, as Agamben would have it, by the image qua image. The human, then, is that being who goes to the cinema. This, however, suggests that the image as such is an object. And in one sense, Agamben might be correct, for the image is in large measure understood today as an object, one ultimately embedded in a specific technical apparatus, the latter situated between the human and the world. In this sense, the camera in photography, the technology of photography, comes to assume precedence over the image as such. It is, at minimum, cast as mediation. As Simondon says of the machine, there is, quote, man, the human, machine, world, the machine being between man and the world, unquote. The image here is thus simply a confirmation of the superlative nature of the technical apparatus or process that brings it into being. Even those like Baudelaire, who had anything but a high regard for the powers of the camera, had no doubt that the technical process formed the essence of photography. It was not a matter in the end of what the process could bring into being. Just got a footnote here. Bazin, for example, also, just in parenthesis, also privileges the camera in photography when he refers to the power of an impassive mechanical process. So just to bring it up to contemporary cinematic theory, you could say that the technology is the key to understanding the way the image operates in a social context. The approach adopted here, however, by me, that is that the photographic technology is meaningless independently of the image, and that this image is not an object, just as the human, even in its transcendence, is not an object. No doubt it will be said that while the image is ontologically rich, it cannot be compared with the ontological richness, as we have implied, of the human. Images are one thing, the human is most decidedly another. The idea that the image as such could in some fundamental sense be revelatory of the human is, it might be claimed, entirely unsustainable. Language in its broadest sense, which would include its semiotic sense, has a much greater claim to be, as Aristotle wished, the human's defining feature. By contrast, the claim of this paper is that the image shows language's transcendent aspect more than language reveals what is innate in the image. Poetry is language speaking, as Heidegger maintained. Poetry, as language speaking, as Heidegger maintained, is really only comprehensible if we acknowledge the image aspect of all linguistic features. Language speaking truly only makes sense once we can appreciate the Archeiropoietos of the image. Archeiropoietos. That is, without the hand of the human. Without the hand of the human. In relation to the human, this no doubt implies that the human is only human in the sense that the inhuman in the human participates in the incarnation of its transcendence. In other words, the ontology of the image is in no way reducible to a humanist productivist metaphysic. Rather, it is a matter of Archeiropoietos, untouched by a human hand, and such would be, this paper argues, the basis of the ontology of the image. This, very noticeably, for those who have eyes to see, but as Lacan said, eyes are rarely for seeing, and very notably, is the position Roland Barthes arrives at when he carried out his meditation on photography. Eulogy to the image and an evocation of Sartre on the imaginary, such were, we know, without always knowing why, the inspiration of Barthes' thought on photography. Before examining Archeiropoietos in more detail, let us recall some significant human image contexts. Thus, for example, the ancient Greeks prior to Plato, as Jean-Pierre Vernon has shown, had no concept of the image as it was consumed in the working of effigy, apparition, and double. Thus, the image here is not an object, not for the Greeks, is not an object, but we could postulate is an entity of radical immanence. When in pre-Platonic Greece we come to the presence of the god, therefore, there is no image on one side and God on the other. Rather, the effigy image is the presence of the god. Thus, in the Iliad, Hecate acts as though the statue with which she is dealing in Athena's tomb is Athena herself. It is only after Plato that the notion of eidolon or simulacrum, that the condition of possibility emerges for the image to be thought as an object, like any other object for that matter, as Jacques Aumont has claimed. Another historian of antiquity, particularly of the Roman period, points to the way that the image as such, in this case the image as sacred, arises in antiquity. Antiquity offered a world of sacred images. It was, for instance, not always possible to differentiate the deity from his or her statue. In Greek language, this gives rise to the interesting ambiguity that, for example, Artemis can mean equally the goddess herself or an image of her, unquote. The enactment of theorio, as we heard yesterday, as a viewing of the object, is not essential to the nature and the working of the image. Quote, statues might be dressed, paraded, washed, fed, and worshipped. They were imagined to have volition and magical power, oracular, talismanic, healing, or malevolent power. And more important, statues were even capable of intervening in legal problems or power politics by granting sanctuary, for instance, unquote. Perhaps we could call on today. Hans Belting argues that it's only with the Reformation that the objectification of images arose, along with the era of art, what he calls the era of art, and that before this there was the era of images. Before the era of art there was the era of images, where the prototype is present in an image, or rather where there is no difference between prototype and image. While this view has been challenged by a number of commentators, it is notable that no one disputes the fact that, as we have seen already, prior to the Reformation, prototype and image can coincide, whereas afterwards this is not the case. The real debate, however, is in fact about whether there was art criticism prior to the modern era. Some critics argue that there was, and whether there are still images in the classical or true sense in the modern era. And with regard to the latter, I argue that there are. In the confrontation with the sacred image, then, the image looks back at the viewer, has an impact on the viewer, to the point perhaps where, in contemporary terms, the image is in part constitutive of the viewer. I've got a quotation from the historian Elsner on this. It just illustrates that point. I'm not going to read it because we're going to run out of time otherwise. So here, in what we've said, it is clear that the image is something that analytically cannot entirely be fathomed. The closest we can get is to say that it is an invisible otherness that cannot be contained within a concept. This quasi-defiance of the concept is not just an occurrence in relation to the effigy and apparition, as was the case in ancient Greece, but is the same across the ages. This is part of the ontology of the image. In other words, in a note here I've got, it is not at all a matter of an historicist approach to the image, where the nature of the image would be relative to the specific historical context, but of the essential nature of the image, whether or not this is rendered extant. The image then is essentially non-conceptual. It is not the object of any mode of theoria, which from Plato to the Church Fathers means contemplation, meditation, vision. The image today, having set out what is at stake in an era of the image, to use Belting's phrase, André Bazin, in his reflection on the ontology of the photographic image, offers a plausible summary of how things are today with the image. Quote, no one, he says, quote, believes any longer in the ontological identity of mould and image. So he's got the language just about, hasn't he, Andre? He's got the, rather than prototype and image, he talks about the mould and the image. And I continue, but all are agreed that the image helps us to remember the subject and preserve him from a second spiritual death. Today, the making of images no longer shares an anthropocentric utilitarian purpose, unquote. No one believes. It may be true in the coincidence of image and prototype or model, but just as a certain, I claim, I argue, I implore, but just as a certain religiosity remains embedded in the universal social fabric, so let us contend there is a coincidence of image and imaged. Ultimately, for Bazin, quote, it is no longer a question of survival after death, but of a larger concept, the creation of an ideal world in the likeness of the real, with its own temporal destiny, unquote. On this basis, there would be two worlds, a real world and a world of images. This is the image as object, the image as essentially a separate representation of the real, a representation that is opaque because quite perceptible in its own right, something that can be analysed as a separate entity. This, as is well known, is what Bazin called realism, and it tends to prevail in Bazin's ontology, even if it is also true that at certain points in his essay he verges towards a notion of the photograph that is not representational, but is the model itself. In contrast to a realist or representational approach, I have said that there is a radical transparency. I have argued in the past that there is a radical transparency or immanence at play in relation to the image and in relation to the imaged. Here, immanence is not to be confused with Sartre's phrase, the illusion of immanence, a phrase Sartre uses to criticise those who posit the image as an independent object. In the illusion of immanence, the image is an already embedded mental construct that at the second degree can supposedly be reflected upon independently of what is imaged. It is as though the image constituted its own autonomous realm in the mind and could be made present through a kind of hyper-reflexivity. In a sense, one type of mental activity, image production, would come to be known to another, namely thinking. The image might then begin as radically immanent in the mind, but it quickly becomes an object of thought when it is the focus of a curious intellect. Indeed, as Mark Rowley says in citing the scholastics Duns Scotus and William of Ockham on the topic of immanence, immanence is, quote, God in his effect, which is identical with his being, unquote. Immanence is God in his effect, which is identical with his being, unquote. On this basis, the image and its effect would be identical with its being or its non-being, given that it is also tempting, despite Heidegger, to posit being as an object. Archeiropoietos. Keith Broadfoot, who works at Sydney University of all places, asks in relation to camera lucida, quote, what of the sacred, of the nothing, of the visible form of invisibility, unquote. And he responds by saying that, quote, herein I believe lies something crucial to the understanding of camera lucida, something that should be explored by returning to Barth's declaration in the book, where he states that his relationship to photography is inescapably shaped by the religious substance out of which he is moulded. I am moulded, he says, unquote. The religious substance out of which he is moulded. Indeed, the photograph is shaped by the Greek and the Orthodox Christian tradition of Archeiropoietos, which from the Greek means unmanufactured. Thus, Greek Byzantine icon images of Christ, or the Veronica shroud, the Turin shroud, and the like are deemed by tradition to be unmanufactured, unshaped and untouched by human hand. Such images are not to be appreciated in terms of their appearance, but strictly in terms of their appearing. A big difference there between appearance and appearing, because the appearance is based on the epistemology of appearance and reality, but the appearing is a different thing. It's related to, obviously, in Heidegger, the notion of truth as appearing, as opposed to veritas, which is a correspondence theory of truth. So it's the appearing as such. Images are the appearing as such. In fact, the fact that they appear, the fact that the image appears in the shrouds, etc. It is this that Barth imports into his study of photographic images, at once evoking the, quote, tradition, unquote, or religious Gemeinschaft, and flying in the face of supposedly secular modernity, which valorizes the human as the originator and creator, not only of specific images, but of culture and society, the very idea supposedly captured in sociology's social construction of reality. The irony could not be more telling. In what is almost a defining feature of secular modernity, the camera, we find a return to a key feature of religious tradition, the radical other of modernity. And those who have died are resurrected by the photograph. What is no more makes its appearance through the image as an Archeiropoietos. Broadfoot also cites a footnote in Bazin's essay which says, quote, "Let us merely note in passing that the Holy Shroud of Turin combines the features alike of relic and photograph." Relic and photograph. Unquote. And Broadfoot also points to a very important study by Georges Didier Huberman in a number of October 1984. He points out that the face in the Turin shroud was first revealed by a photograph developed in May 1894 by the photographer Secondo Pia. And before this, the face, had never been seen or noticed. Although it is not the main concern of Didier Huberman's study, it is worth noting the difference between image and index. Okay, so on the right hand of the screen, we've got the photograph, and on the left hand, the negative of that photo, the negative of the image, which is shown in an article. I'm going to have a separate file with the acknowledgements of this, because I know there's copyright issues involved if we're streaming, I would imagine. So I'm taking a risk, though. I'll pay, probably. I'll promise. Okay. So just to recall, these images, or the image as such, has been revealed by the photograph, that it wasn't noticed prior to it being photographed. So we couldn't have a stronger link between photograph and relic than that. Anyway, the difference between image and index arises out of this, because a lot of people have been concerned when it comes to the shroud, it could be the Veronica shroud as well, as to whether it was the actual shroud that wrapped Jesus when he was taken down from the cross, from the crucifixion. It's not just a matter of, well, is that his face, which is another issue, but a question of whether this is the real cloth or not. I'm not so interested, believe it or not, in whether or not it was the cloth that wrapped Jesus. But what I'm interested in is the dynamics of the image in relation to people's concern about the cloth. What is the difference between being concerned with the image as such and the cloth, as to whether it was part of Jesus' process of crucifixion and burial? I wanted to try and distinguish between an image and an indexicality, because I think a lot of the time when people think they're talking about images, they're talking about an index. And anyway, look, I'll read a little bit of it, 3 minutes worth, and do my best to summarise the point that I'm making. So, as commentators have often remarked, Barth's essay on photography is supposedly founded on the latter's indexicality. I think Rosenkranz, for example, says that after Barth, photography is indexical and indexical art. This is because Barth himself makes the chemical nature of the photographic process a key point in his essay. The light that hit the subject at the time of taking the shot then hits the viewer possibly a century later. The photograph then becomes an index of the play of light that generates the image. We do not consciously perceive the light in any way, but we deduce that it must be present in a fundamental way. This then is an analytic truth about the photograph. It is what we know about the analogue photographic process and serves to define that process. However, the presence of the image is not part of an analytic process that is inaugurated by indexicality. Were this to be so, and one cannot help thinking that semiotics wants it to be so, an image would be equivalent, as occurs in The Name of the Rose with William, looking at the footprints in the snow, the hoof prints in the snow, and not at the horse that left them. An image would be equivalent to the marks that refer to the imaged rather than being the image themselves. Seen in this way, it may well be worthwhile to revisit Levinas and Derrida on the trace in order to establish the status of the image in their respective philosophies. The Turin Shroud then introduces a profound play between index and image, with the image emerging by way of a photograph. The indexical status of the shroud emerges when the marks on the cloth are considered as the actual possible or impossible traces of Christ's mortal body. This, like indexicality in general, raises the issue of evidence, and in this case the issue of what counts as reliable evidence that the marks on the shroud were left by Christ. So an image, by contrast, is not a trace in any conventional sense. Instead, it is the presence of the imaged as such. Note here that Barth firmly rejects the idea that a photograph can be read, which is characteristic of what we find if we have something as an index. A photograph of Christ, therefore, would be Christ himself as present. For some, of course, the indexical question never goes away, and perhaps for them the image never really appears. The indexical question would be, is this really Christ? A similar question can be asked of one's reflection in the mirror. Is this really me? No, it's not you. It's only a reflection, unquote. As a true image, the mirror enables one to say, this is me. Thus, before an image we say, this is Christ, this is Pierre, to recall Sartre's friend, whether fictional or not, referred to in the imaginary. This is my great-great-grandfather in the family collection. The image as spectre thus emerges here. A consideration of indexicality, and there is a lot more that can be said, leads us back to Barth's famous statement that the noem of photography is related to its chemical process. So we might ask, however, whether the photograph is not literally, but analytically speaking, quote, an emanation of the referent, unquote. Is it the image which is evoked here, or indexicality? I suggest that it is the latter. The photograph, which in common parlance can be seen, becomes an evocation of the technology of the play of light of a photosensitive surface, something that cannot be seen but which one knows is the case. As with Baudelaire, photography is here defined by its technical nature. As such, the photographic image would be produced by the human hand, albeit a hand inseparable from technics. If we were to follow Bernard Stiegler, there is no human gesture which is not, at one and the same time, a technical gesture. In his desire, as written in Camera Lucida, Barth wants to be with the image as such, but as thinker and critic working in the wake of the principles of thought enunciated by the European Enlightenment, his language often falls on the side of indexicality. This is so despite statements like the following, quote, a photograph is always invisible. It is not it that we see, unquote. Indeed, the image itself is an invisibility, or at least is independent of visibility, as Marie-José Montaigne shows in the context of Byzantine culture. And I go on to talk a little bit about Montaigne's work. I'm not going to do that here. So what we've got then, so if the image can make the divine, which was the issue in Byzantine culture, if the image makes the divine present in a certain way, it will also make the infinite present. However, this couple, infinite divine, which emerges in light of a reflection on Archeiropoietos in camera lucida, opens up a further dimension of the image for thought. Thinking this dimension must, however, or thinking further on this dimension must be postponed for another day or another conference. Thank you. My pièce de résistance, I've got to show you this, wait a minute. Jesus, how do I get out of here?
Tell me what you want to do.
I just want to go over here, I want to get another image. This is Archeiropoietos in action, I want to show you.
Yes, which one?
This one.
Nature.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. We better put in the file for the acknowledgements. Can I get this? Okay, what can you see in this photograph? Does anybody see an image on the side? Can you see it? Can you see it? There you go. It's Christ himself emerging. He just appeared in the image. He just appeared. There is a caption to that which is about the fact that somebody on one cold winter's day in America took this photograph, and when they were developing it, a bit like the Turin Shroud, they discovered this image of Christ, as they thought, in the photograph. It's up to you now. Over to you.